When most people picture a cowboy, they imagine a white man riding across the plains of Texas or Arizona, hat tilted low, lasso in hand, spurs clinking with each step. Hollywood has painted the cowboy as the ultimate American icon, rugged, stoic, fiercely independent, and almost always white. But here's the truth. Most people have never heard. The very first cowboys in America were black. Their skills, their traditions, and even the word cowboy itself carry the imprint of African influence. The story of the cowboy is not just one of the American West, it's one of the African diaspora, survival, innovation, and erasure. And reclaiming this history changes the way we see America's past. Let's begin. Before there were ranches in Texas or cattle drives to Kansas, we need to look back to West Africa, where for centuries, people had been herding cattle, goats, and horses across vast savannas. Among the Fulani, Hausa, and other pastoral peoples, horsemanship was not just a skill, but a cultural art form. Fulani herders could guide their cattle with whistles, songs, and subtle movements, a tradition passed down through generations. These practices predated the arrival of Europeans in the Americas by centuries. In fact, when enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the New World, many carried with them deep knowledge of animal husbandry. They knew how to ride, how to rope, how to heal sick animals, and how to manage large herds across dangerous landscapes. This expertise would prove indispensable. In the early Spanish colonies of the Americas, ranching was already being established. Spanish vaqueros, the original cowherds of the New World, blended their traditions with those of African workers brought to the colonies. The Spanish word vaquero comes from vaca, meaning cow, and it is from these vaqueros that the English-speaking world developed its own cowboy culture. But here's the catch. A huge percentage of those working as vaqueros were African or of African descent. By the 1500s and 1600s, enslaved Africans in Mexico, the Caribbean, and later the American South were working with livestock on plantations and ranches. They weren't merely laborers, they were the backbone of ranching culture. By the 1800s, when cattle ranching exploded in the United States after the Civil War, African Americans were already seasoned experts. Freedmen, formerly enslaved people, found work on ranches throughout Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. For many, ranching offered freedom that farming or city labor could not. Out on the open range, a man was judged less by the color of his skin and more by his ability to ride, rope, and endure. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys in the American West were black. That's right, 25%. But how often do we see that on screen? In dime novels? In John Wayne movies? Almost never. Why the erasure? Part of it lies in the word itself, cowboy. Originally, the term was derogatory. White cattlemen called black workers boys, no matter their age. A black man managing cattle was a cowboy, while white workers were often called cowhands or cowpunchers. Over time, the derogatory label stuck and eventually became the romanticized title for all men of the range. It's a striking reminder of how language itself carries racism, but also how black labor defined the cowboy tradition so strongly that the word could not be erased. Even when people tried to erase the people, the cowboy life was far from glamorous. Days were long, nights were cold, and dangers were constant. Black cowboys drove cattle through swollen rivers, across blistering deserts, and over mountains. They fought off rustlers, calmed stampedes, and braved storms. Yet they also left their mark on culture. Their music, field hollers, work songs, and early blues rhythms blended with Mexican corridos and Anglo folk songs, shaping the soundscape of the West. Their styles of dress, wide-brimmed hats to block the sun, bandanas for dust, boots reinforced for riding, were practical adaptations that became iconic fashion. Their stories, often passed orally, told of resilience, humor, and skill in the face of constant hardship. Take Nat Love, for example, known as Deadwood Dick. Born into slavery in Tennessee in 1854, Love grew up to become one of the most famous black cowboys in history. He wrote his own autobiography, describing cattle drives, gunfights, and wild adventures across the plains. Or consider Bill Pickett, born in 1870, who invented bulldogging, the rodeo sport where a rider leaps from a horse to wrestle a steer to the ground. Pickett toured the world with his daring feats, inspiring generations of rodeo riders. These men weren't exceptions. They were representatives of a much larger hidden tradition. The myth of the cowboy, as white, only solidified in the 20th century, when Hollywood westerns exploded in popularity. Black cowboys were written out of the script, their stories ignored in favor of a sanitized version of history that placed white men at the center of America's frontier myth. Yet in recent years, the truth has begun to resurface. Documentaries, books, and black rodeo associations across the United States are reclaiming the narrative, honoring the fact that the first cowboys were indeed black. Understanding this history matters. It dismantles the false idea that black people only played a marginal role in America's story. It shows that African traditions didn't just survive slavery, they thrived, adapted, and helped shape one of the most enduring symbols of American identity. The cowboy hat, the lasso, the cattle drive. These aren't just symbols of Texas or the Wild West. They are symbols of African ingenuity woven into the fabric of American culture. So when we ask, who were the first cowboys? The answer isn't John Wayne. It isn't the Lone Ranger, though interestingly, the Lone Ranger himself may have been inspired by a real black lawman named Bass Reeves. The answer is this: the first cowboys were African, and the first American cowboys were black. Their legacy is everywhere, if we choose to see it. And in this series, we'll uncover that legacy piece by piece, restoring the African roots of the cowboy myth, and reclaiming a story that has been too long ignored. To truly understand how black cowboys became central to America's story, we need to dig deeper into the African traditions of ranching that predated the western frontier. Long before Texas Longhorns roamed the plains, Africans had already mastered the art of herding, horsemanship, and survival on open land. This wasn't a skill picked up in the New World, it was knowledge carried across the Atlantic, woven into the very DNA of the cowboy lifestyle. Let's look at West Africa in particular. Among the Fulani people, who spanned regions of what is today Mali, Nigeria, and Senegal, cattle herding was a way of life. These pastoralists relied on cattle not only for milk, meat, and trade, but also for cultural identity. Fulani boys learned to ride horses at a young age, using them to manage herds across dangerous terrain. They practiced selective breeding to strengthen their animals, cared for them with herbal remedies, and used advanced techniques to move large groups across vast distances. These skills would be transplanted into the Americas, where similar challenges awaited. The Fulani were not alone. In other parts of Africa, the Hausa and Tuareg peoples also cultivated traditions of horsemanship. Horses were symbols of power, status, and mobility. They were also instruments of practical survival in regions where trade routes and long migrations defined everyday life. Africans had centuries of experience in equestrian culture before Europeans began colonizing the Americas. So when enslaved Africans were forced onto ships and carried across the Atlantic, they didn't arrive as blank slates. They arrived as experts, with knowledge that would become essential in the New World. When the Spanish began colonizing Mexico and the Caribbean in the 1500s, they brought cattle with them from Europe. But ranching in the hot, rugged landscapes of the Americas required more than European know-how. Indigenous peoples contributed local knowledge of the land, and Africans brought expertise in animal husbandry. Together, these traditions blended to form the roots of cowboy culture. Africans worked as vaqueros, the Spanish word for cowherd. They rode horses, branded cattle, and performed the tough, dangerous work of ranching. By the 1600s, Africans and their descendants were already the backbone of ranch life in Mexico, Cuba, and parts of the American South. The English word cowboy itself owes much to this history. In the American South during slavery, the term boy was used to demean black men regardless of age. A black man working with cattle was called a cowboy, while his white counterparts might be referred to as cowhands or cowpunchers. Over time, the term stuck and spread, but its origins highlight the deeply racialized context of ranch labor. The irony is powerful. The very word we now use to describe one of America's most iconic figures began as a label for black men. After the Civil War, the cattle industry exploded. Millions of cattle roamed Texas, and the demand for beef in northern cities created an economic boom. Freed black men, many of whom had experience managing livestock during slavery, stepped into the role of cowboys. They joined cattle drives, moving herds from Texas up to railheads in Kansas, where the animals would be shipped east. These journeys could last months, taking men through dangerous rivers, hostile territories, and grueling weather. For black cowboys, the open range offered opportunities denied to them elsewhere. Racism was still ever present, but ranching was one of the few industries where skill mattered more than skin color. A man who could rope, ride, and endure was respected, at least on the trail. Estimates suggest that 1 in 4 cowboys in the late 1800s was black. That's 25% of the labor force shaping the American West. And yet, you wouldn't know it from most history books or Hollywood films. The erasure of black cowboys is one of the clearest examples of how cultural memory gets rewritten to favor a white narrative. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to seriously document the contributions of African Americans to cowboy culture. Before that, black cowboys existed in oral histories, family stories, and the fading photographs of rodeo circuits. The legacy of African traditions is also visible in cowboy techniques, roping methods, cattle calls, and even songs sung on the trail have echoes of African practices. Many black cowboys blended spirituals and work songs into their routines, creating a unique soundscape that later influenced blues and country music. These songs weren't just entertainment, they were survival tools, helping men stay awake on long night watches or calming restless cattle during storms. The African roots of this music are undeniable, and they remind us that the cowboy was not just a worker but a cultural creator. But perhaps the most striking African influence can be seen in community and resilience. In Africa, pastoral societies often emphasized cooperation, as herding required collective effort to manage large animals. This sense of solidarity carried over into the cowboy world, where groups of men, many of them black, relied on each other to survive the perils of the trail. Bonds forged in the harsh realities of ranch life created networks of trust and mutual respect that transcended some of the rigid social barriers of the time. Reframing the cowboy as black is not about erasing others from history. It's about restoring truth. It's about acknowledging that one of the most celebrated American icons was shaped by African knowledge, African labor, and African resilience. The cowboy is not just a white man's myth. It's a black man's reality too. And the more we peel back the layers of history, the clearer that truth becomes. If you heard the African roots of ranching and horsemanship, then Now I Will takes us into the thick of the cattle drives, the dangerous, grueling, and yet defining journeys where black cowboys carved out their place in history. This was the proving ground. It was here, on the open range, that their skills shone brightest, and their legacy was cemented, even if history later tried to erase them. After the Civil War, Texas was overrun with cattle. Millions of longhorns roamed wild, unbranded, and largely worthless, unless they could be herded to railroads in Kansas and shipped to northern markets. The cattle drive was born out of necessity. Ranchers needed skilled laborers who could rope, brand, ride, and survive weeks, or even months, of non-stop challenges. Black cowboys stepped into this role with precision. Many had spent their youth tending livestock under slavery. Now, for the first time, they could earn wages for their expertise. The cattle drive was no romantic adventure. It was grueling labor, stretching from dawn until after dark. Men slept under the stars, woke up sore, and faced every kind of danger imaginable. Stampedes were the worst nightmare. A single loud sound could send thousands of longhorns charging blindly, hooves pounding like thunder across the plains. In these moments, skill made the difference between life and death. Black cowboys were often the ones trusted to ride at the front, guiding the herd and calming the chaos. Their sharp whistles, firm hands, and steady voices could break through the frenzy, saving both cattle and men. Then there was the weather. The Great Plains were unforgiving, with scorching heat by day and freezing cold at night. Rainstorms turned trails into rivers of mud, while lightning storms threatened both herds and riders. Black cowboys, hardened by years of labor and survival, adapted quickly. Their resilience and endurance earned them respect, even from white counterparts who might never have acknowledged them off the trail. Water crossings were another deadly challenge. Longhorns hated swimming, and rivers like the Red or the Arkansas could sweep away entire herds in minutes. Cowboys had to push cattle into the current, often riding alongside them to keep the animals moving. Black cowboys, many of whom had grown up near rivers and developed strong swimming skills, played an essential role in these crossings. They risked their lives repeatedly to get the herds across safely, and then there were the human dangers. Outlaws roamed the frontier, ready to steal cattle or ambush a vulnerable camp. Native resistance was also a factor, as many indigenous nations saw the cattle drives as invasions of their lands. In these tense moments, black cowboys proved themselves as fighters as well as herders. They carried rifles, guarded the herd at night, and protected the group. The trail was a crucible where toughness was the only currency. Despite the hardships, cattle drives offered something rare for black men in post-Civil War America: a degree of freedom. On the trail, ability mattered more than race. If you could ride, rope, and endure, you had a place. Black cowboys often described this as a form of liberation. Yes, racism still existed, but it was muted by necessity. A rancher couldn't afford to dismiss a man who could save his herd from disaster. In some cases, black cowboys even rose to positions of leadership, guiding younger riders and making critical decisions. The cattle drives also created space for cultural exchange. Around the campfire, cowboys of different backgrounds, black, Mexican, indigenous, and white, shared stories, songs, and food. Black cowboys brought work songs rooted in African traditions, blending rhythm and call and response into the soundtrack of the trail. These songs kept men awake during long night watches and calmed restless cattle. Over time, this music influenced American folk, blues, and eventually even country music. Once again, African heritage shaped the cultural DNA of the West. The day-to-day life of a black cowboy was still harsh. Pay was low, often less than $1 a day. Food was monotonous: beans, salt pork, and biscuits. Clothes wore out quickly, boots cracked, and saddles chafed. And when drives ended in Kansas cow towns, like Dodge City or Abilene. Black cowboys often faced segregation in saloons, hotels, and dance halls. The frontier was freer than the South, but it was not free of prejudice. Still, many black cowboys preferred the trail to any other work available because it offered dignity and adventure that plantation fields never could. Estimates suggest that as many as 8,000 black men rode the trails in the late 1800s. They were not a footnote, they were a quarter of the entire cowboy workforce. Names like Beau Zicard, Nat Love, and Bill Pickett would become legendary. Though most remained anonymous, their stories lost in the dust of the prairie. Yet their presence was undeniable. They built the cowboy culture as much as anyone else, branding, driving, and taming the West. Hollywood, however, would later strip them from the narrative. In the 20th century, cowboy films portrayed an all-white frontier, erasing the diversity that actually defined it. The real cowboys were black, Mexican, indigenous, and white, but in the movies, they were nearly all white. This distortion robbed generations of African Americans of a vital piece of their history. Reclaiming the story of black cowboys means restoring truth. It means recognizing that the men who braved stampedes, storms, and rivers were not side characters, but central figures. Their labor built the cattle industry. Their songs shaped American music. Their resilience embodied the spirit of the West. If he said do, to deny them their place, is to deny the very reality of history. The cattle drives of the late 1800s were more than journeys. They were crucibles where black cowboys proved themselves indispensable. Their skills, courage, and humanity carried herds across hundreds of miles and reshaped the destiny of the West. Without them, the myth of the cowboy would not exist. The cowboy hat, the lasso, the trail song, all of it carries their imprint. This is why when we say the first cowboys were black, it's not a slogan, it's a fact, written in dust, sweat, and hoofprints across the American plains. And the deeper we look, the more undeniable it becomes. If the cattle drives prove that black cowboys were indispensable, then the stories of individual men show us their genius, bravery, and resilience in vivid color. Names like Nat Love, Beau Zicard, and Bill Pickett remind us that behind the statistics and forgotten photographs were real people, living legends, whose lives capture both the grit of the frontier and the erasure of history. Part 4 is about their stories. Let's begin with Nat Love, perhaps the most famous black cowboy of them all. Born enslaved in Tennessee in 1854, Nat grew up learning to ride horses and handle livestock, even before emancipation. When freedom came, he took those skills west, chasing opportunity on the open range. Nat became renowned for his incredible roping, branding, and sharpshooting abilities. His reputation spread so far that in 1876, he entered a cowboy contest in Deadwood, South Dakota, on the very 4th of July, competing against some of the best riders and ropers in the West. Nat dominated every event, winning roping, shooting, and wild horse riding competitions. The crowd crowned him Deadwood Dick, a nickname he carried proudly for the rest of his life. Nat's autobiography, published in 1907, is one of the few first-hand accounts we have from a black cowboy. Though it contains flourishes and exaggerations, as all Wild West memoirs do, it offers a priceless window into the life of a man who became a folk hero. Nat tells of cattle drives across Texas and New Mexico, run-ins with native warriors, brushes with death, and the camaraderie of life on the trail. For young African Americans growing up in the Jim Crow era, Nat Love's story was more than entertainment. It was a declaration that black men had been central to the Wild West, despite Hollywood's attempts to erase them. Another legendary figure was Beau Iccard, whose life reads like something straight out of a classic Western. Born enslaved in Mississippi, Iccard moved to Texas as a child, and later became a trusted cowboy under rancher Charles Goodnight, one of the founders of the cattle industry. Beau rode thousands of miles on the famous Goodnight Loving Trail, driving herds through some of the most dangerous country in the frontier. He became Goodnight's right-hand man, valued for his courage, reliability, and loyalty. Goodnight himself acknowledged Iccard's greatness. When Beau died in 1929, Goodnight paid for his tombstone and personally composed the inscription, "Served with me 4 years on the Goodnight Loving Trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches." Splendid behavior. For a white cattle baron, to write those words about a black man in that era speaks volumes. Beau Iccard's story was so impactful that he even inspired a character in Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Lonesome Dove, a rare instance where black cowboy history seeped into popular culture. And then there was Bill Pickett, a man whose name should be shouted alongside Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok, but too often is left in the margins. Born in 1870 in Texas to formerly enslaved parents, Pickett invented a rodeo technique that is still used today, bulldogging. Inspired by how farm dogs subdued steers, Pickett would leap from his horse onto a steer, bite its upper lip, and wrestle it to the ground with his bare hands. The move was as wild as it sounds, and it electrified rodeo audiences. Pickett toured with the 101 Ranch Wild West show, performing across the country, and even in Europe. He became the first black cowboy inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, though not until decades after his death. Pickett's career is especially important because it challenges the myth of the white cowboy hero head-on. He was a showman, an innovator, and a symbol of black excellence in a field that the mainstream refused to acknowledge. Rodeo, often celebrated as a quintessentially American sport, owes much of its spectacle to Pickett's creativity and daring. Yet for years, he was left out of the story, his name known only to rodeo insiders and black communities who kept his memory alive. These men, Nat Love, Beau Iccard, Bill Pickett, were not exceptions. They were part of a much larger community of black cowboys who worked, endured, and innovated across the West. But their stories remind us of the sheer scale of the erasure that took place. Hollywood never made a blockbuster about Nat Love's Deadwood triumph. School textbooks never highlighted Beau Iccard's courage. Rodeo fans cheered bulldogging without learning that it was Pickett, a black cowboy, who invented it. The cultural theft is staggering. What makes this even more painful is that their legacies were not just about individual glory. They represented something larger, the reclamation of dignity for black Americans in the post-slavery era. At a time when the South was descending into Jim Crow, lynching, and segregation, the West offered possibilities, however limited. The cowboy trail didn't erase racism, but it opened doors. Men like Nat Love and Beau Iccard could carve out reputations based on skill, not skin color. That freedom, however fragile, was a radical thing in 19th century America. Their stories also remind us of how deeply African traditions shaped the cowboy lifestyle. Nat Love's rope tricks were echoes of African herding techniques. Bill Pickett's bulldogging, wild as it was, carried shades of ancestral methods of animal control. Even the songs and humor around the campfire bore rhythms and cadences rooted in Africa. These men weren't just surviving in a white world, they were infusing it with African genius. By telling their stories, we challenge centuries of erasure. We place Nat Love beside Wyatt Earp, Bose Card beside Wild Bill, Bill Pickett beside Buffalo Bill, where they belong. The myth of the American West is incomplete without them. And more than that, the myth itself changes when we center them. The cowboy becomes not just a rugged white frontiersman, but a symbol of multiracial endurance, creativity, and struggle. When we say the first cowboys were black, these are the men who prove it. They rode, they fought, they invented, they inspired. And though their names were nearly lost, they are rising again, carried on the wind of truth across the prairies they once called home. If Nat Love, Bose Card, and Bill Pickett reveal the brilliance of black cowboys, then the question becomes, why don't we know their names as easily as we know Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, or Billy the Kid? The answer lies in cultural erasure. How the myths of the West were carefully constructed to serve a vision of America that excluded black contributions. This part of the story is not about saddles and spurs, but about stories themselves. Who tells them, who gets remembered, and who is written out. The late 19th century was a time when America was building its national mythology. The Civil War was over, the frontier was closing, and the nation wanted heroic figures to embody its ideals of toughness, freedom, and self-reliance. The cowboy became that figure. But in order for the cowboy to serve as a unifying national symbol, he had to be cast in a certain mold: white, independent, masculine, and untainted by the racial realities of the country. Black cowboys didn't fit the narrative. Their very existence challenged the myth that black men were destined only for servitude. Popular culture of the time played a massive role in this distortion. Dime novels, cheap, mass-printed adventure stories, flooded the market in the late 1800s. These books romanticized the West, filled with tales of outlaws, gunfighters, and rugged frontiersmen. But they almost always featured white heroes. If black characters appeared, they were usually sidekicks, caricatures, or invisible altogether. Dime novelists knew their audience, white readers who wanted to imagine themselves as the inheritors of the frontier spirit. A black cowboy hero would have disrupted that fantasy. Then came Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, one of the most popular forms of mass entertainment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody traveled the U.S. and Europe with a huge theatrical production that reenacted the West on stage. Audiences thrilled to see cowboys lasso cattle, Native Americans attack stagecoaches, and sharpshooters like Annie Oakley hit impossible targets. The show shaped the global image of the West for millions. But in Buffalo Bill's carefully staged performances, black cowboys had little to no presence. Their labor might have powered the real frontier, but in the fantasy version, they were erased. Hollywood took that erasure and amplified it. From the silent films of the 1910s to the golden age of westerns in the 1940s and 1950s, the cowboy on screen was almost exclusively white. John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Clint Eastwood, these actors became the faces of the cowboy myth. Their films rarely acknowledged that 1 in 4 real cowboys had been black. Instead, black characters were relegated to comic relief, menial roles, or completely absent. The American imagination was being colonized by images that whitened the frontier and pushed black contributions into the shadows. This erasure had consequences beyond entertainment. It shaped education. For much of the 20th century, history textbooks taught children about the Wild West without mentioning black cowboys at all. Students learned about cattle drives, range wars, and the settlement of the frontier, but they never heard the names Nat Love, Bose Card, or Bill Pickett. By omission, Black people were excluded from the story of America's westward expansion. That silence reinforced racist stereotypes, that Black Americans had no role in building the nation, no claim to its heroic past. The irony is that Black cowboys were hiding in plain sight. In photographs from the 19th century, you can see them standing in groups of drovers, mounted on horseback, holding ropes and saddles. Ranch records show them being hired, paid and respected for their skills. Oral traditions in Black communities preserved their stories, even as mainstream culture erased them. Families passed down tales of ancestors who rode the trails, worked the herds, and held their own alongside any white cowboy. Yet until scholars and activists began reclaiming these histories in the late 20th century, those voices remained marginal. Why did this happen? Because the myth of the cowboy was more than entertainment, it was political. By whitening the cowboy, America could project an image of itself as a nation forged by white pioneers, taming the wilderness with grit and guns. Acknowledging that Black men had been central to that story threatened to upend the racial hierarchy. It suggested that Black Americans had been heroes, innovators, and builders of the West, not just victims of slavery and segregation. That truth was dangerous to a society invested in white supremacy. Yet the erasure was never complete. In the margins of culture, Black cowboy stories persisted. Rodeos in Black communities celebrated figures like Bill Pickett. Blues musicians sang songs about life on the range. In cities like Houston and Dallas, Black rodeo traditions continued quietly for generations. These cultural practices kept the memory alive until mainstream historians began to catch up. Today, there's a growing movement to reclaim the Black cowboy legacy. Museums host exhibitions of rare photographs. Books and documentaries tell the stories that Hollywood ignored. Modern rodeos celebrate the contributions of African American cowboys. And perhaps most importantly, young people of color are rediscovering this history as a source of pride and identity. To know that the first cowboys were Black is to challenge centuries of lies and to rewrite who gets to be a hero in America's story. The cowboy was never just white. He was African American, Mexican, Native, and mixed. By bringing those truths back into focus, we don't weaken the cowboy myth, we enrich it. We restore the fullness of the past, showing that the frontier was shaped by a diverse, multicultural people whose struggles and triumphs laid the foundations of modern America. So the next time you see a Western, ask yourself, whose story is missing? Whose saddle was left empty on screen? Behind every white cowboy hero, there were countless Black men who rode the same trails, fought the same battles, and deserved the same honor. Telling their stories is not just about the past, it's about justice, dignity, and truth. If mainstream America erased Black cowboys from its official mythology, then Black communities themselves refused to forget. One of the most powerful ways they kept the legacy alive was through rodeo, music, and oral tradition. These cultural practices became both a celebration of skill and a quiet act of resistance, a way of saying, we were here, we still ride. Let's start with rodeo. By the late 19th century, the cattle drive era was giving way to a more settled ranching economy. Barbed wire fences ended the open range. Railroads made long cattle drives less necessary. But cowboys, both Black and white, still craved competition and camaraderie. Out of that desire grew the rodeo, where working skills like roping, bronc riding, and steer wrestling were transformed into public spectacle. For Black cowboys, rodeo became a stage where their talents could not be denied. One name towers above the rest: Bill Pickett. Born in 1870 to formerly enslaved parents in Texas, Pickett invented an entirely new rodeo sport, bulldogging, later called steer wrestling. The story goes that he was inspired by watching trained dogs bite a cow's lip to control it. Pickett adapted the technique himself, leaping from his horse onto a steer and wrestling it down by biting its lip. Crowds went wild. His daring act made him a rodeo legend. For decades, Pickett toured with Wild West shows, performing across the United States and even in Europe. He became one of the first African American celebrities of the rodeo world. Though mainstream history downplayed his race, some advertisements even falsely billed him as Mexican or Indian to avoid acknowledging a black star. Pickett's bulldogging became a standard rodeo event, one still performed today. Yet for decades, his name was absent from official rodeo halls of fame. It wasn't until 1971, long after his death, that Bill Pickett was posthumously inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. That recognition symbolized both the greatness of black cowboys and the long delay in honoring them. But Bill Pickett wasn't alone. Across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Southwest, black cowboys created their own rodeo circuits. They often weren't welcome in white competitions, so they organized community events where they could showcase their talents. These black rodeos were more than sporting events. They were social gatherings, cultural celebrations, and affirmations of identity. Families came together to cheer their riders, eat, dance, and keep alive traditions that mainstream America ignored. Even today, the tradition continues. The Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, founded in 1984, is the longest-running black rodeo in the United States. It tours nationally, bringing together black riders from across the country and honoring the heritage of African American cowboys. Crowds pack the stands not only for the spectacle of barrel racing and steer wrestling, but also for the pride of reclaiming a history once erased. For many young black kids, seeing riders who look like them is revolutionary. It says, "This is your legacy too." Beyond rodeo, music carried the cowboy story forward. The blues, one of the most influential American musical traditions, often echoed the rhythms of cowboy life. Black cowboys sang work songs on the trail, much like African American field haulers in the South. These songs kept time during long rides, soothed restless cattle, and helped men endure isolation on the range. While white America romanticized the cowboy with ballads and folk songs, black cowboys infused their music with African rhythms and spiritual undertones. This blending of traditions would eventually influence country, blues, and even early jazz. Take the case of Henry Ragtime Texas Thomas, an early blues musician, born in 1874 in Big Sandy, Texas. His songs like Cow Cow Blues and Texas Easy Street carried echoes of frontier life. Scholars argue that Thomas's music reflects the cultural world of black cowboys, songs born of horseback journeys, campfire nights, and the mix of African and American folk traditions. Through music, the memory of the black cowboy lived on, even when textbooks ignored it. Oral history was equally vital. Families in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New Mexico passed down stories of fathers, grandfathers, and uncles who rode the trails. These weren't mythic figures in dime novels, but real men who broke horses, roped steers, and endured the dangers of the frontier. Around kitchen tables and community gatherings, these stories became part of family identity. Even if Hollywood erased them, in black households, the cowboy was never forgotten. In the mid-20th century, black rodeos and cowboy culture began to intertwine with broader currents of African American pride. During the Civil Rights Movement, the very existence of black cowboys challenged stereotypes. If the American cowboy symbolized independence and strength, then to say, "We were the first cowboys" was to claim a share of that identity. It was to insist that black Americans had always been central to the national story, not outsiders. The endurance of black rodeos into the present day speaks volumes. They are not just about nostalgia or sport. They are living museums, performances of history that keep traditions alive. When a young rider competes in the Bill Pickett Invitational, they are riding in the footsteps of ancestors who carved a place in the West with skill, courage, and resilience. Rodeo, music, and oral history together form a counter-narrative to the whitewashed myth of the cowboy. They show that even when mainstream culture tried to erase black contributions, communities found ways to remember, to celebrate, and to pass the torch forward. The resilience of these traditions mirrors the resilience of the cowboys themselves. Against exclusion, they created their own spaces. Against silence, they raised their voices. Against invisibility, they rode proudly into arenas where the world could not look away. The first cowboys were black, and through rodeo arenas, blues songs, and family stories, they never stopped riding. When we think of the cowboy, a certain image immediately comes to mind: the wide-brimmed hat, the boots with spurs, the lasso twirling through the air. Hollywood has burned this picture into our collective imagination, but what most people don't realize is that many of these symbols of cowboy life trace directly back to black cowboys and the African influence on ranching culture. Clothing, language, music, and even mannerisms all were shaped by black men and women whose presence on the frontier was far more significant than history books suggest. Let's begin with fashion. The broad-brimmed hat, for instance, was not a creation of Hollywood costume designers, but a practical piece of gear adapted by cowboys of all backgrounds. Black cowboys, in particular, shaped its style by blending African and Caribbean traditions of wide head coverings with the needs of the Western sun, while white cowboys often preferred smaller brimmed caps or military-inspired headwear. It was black and Mexican vaqueros who popularized the wide brim that became the standard. Likewise, the bandana, tied around the face to block dust or worn around the neck as protection, was commonly associated with African workers on ranches and fields, long before it became a movie prop. Boots tell another story. Enslaved Africans on plantations were often skilled leather workers, and when emancipation came, many turned their craft to ranching gear. The distinctive pointed-toe cowboy boot, ideal for slipping into stirrups, was refined and popularized by Black and Latino craftsmen. Spurs, too, became both a tool and a status symbol, decorated with designs drawn from African art traditions. Every piece of the cowboy outfit carries layers of history that Hollywood later stripped of its African origins. Language may be even more telling. Many of the words we associate with cowboy talk, like lasso, rodeo, and mustang, came through Spanish vaqueros, but black cowboys left their mark on slang and style of speech. Their African-American vernacular English infused the cowboy dialect with rhythm and cadence. Words like buckaroo, derived from vaquero, often referred to black ranch hands. Even the idea of cowboy poetry, long celebrated at Western festivals, has deep roots in the oral storytelling traditions that enslaved Africans carried into freedom and adapted for life on the trail. Around the campfire, black cowboys were known for telling tales that blended humor, wisdom, and cautionary lessons, echoes of African griots who preserved history through words. Music is perhaps the clearest thread. The familiar image of a cowboy strumming a guitar by the fire owes much to black influence. The guitar itself entered the Americas through Spanish and Moorish traditions, but was deeply shaped by African rhythms. Black cowboys adapted work songs and spirituals into trail music, using them to keep cattle calm during night watches. These cowboy lullabies often carried the call and response style common in African traditions. Later, these songs evolved into blues, country, and Western music. Without black cowboys, the soundscape of the American West would be unrecognizable. Hollywood's portrayal of cowboys owes much to these cultural borrowings, though the industry rarely gave credit. Take the swaggering walk of the classic movie Cowboy, the easy tilt of a hat, the way a rider swings into a saddle with practiced grace. These movements were learned on the job, and black cowboys were masters of them. The real-life Bill Pickett, Nat Love, and Bass Reeves were models of skill and style, but Hollywood films rarely showed black men in cowboy hats, unless they were playing servants or sidekicks. Instead, white actors borrowed their look and swagger, repackaging it as a white identity. Even some of Hollywood's most iconic cowboy heroes were based on real black men. Consider Bass Reeves, the legendary U.S. Marshal, who captured over 3,000 outlaws in his career. Many historians argue he was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, one of America's most enduring cowboy characters. Reeves rode with a Native American partner, wore disguises, used clever tactics, and left silver bullets at crime scenes, traits later absorbed into the Lone Ranger myth. Yet in films and radio shows, his black identity was erased. The cowboy hero became white, while the black origins were hidden. Clothing, language, music, and Hollywood imagery all point to a simple truth. The cowboy identity we celebrate today is an African American inheritance as much as it is a Western one. Black cowboys shaped not just how ranching was done, but how it looked, sounded, and felt. They brought artistry to their gear, rhythm to their songs, wit to their stories, and charisma to their presence. If the cowboy is America's symbol of rugged independence, then black Americans gave that symbol much of its flavor and power. Yet this cultural influence was not always voluntary. Black cowboys often faced exclusion from mainstream competitions, movies, and historical accounts. Their styles were borrowed without acknowledgement, their contributions minimized, their faces left out of murals and posters. This makes it even more important to trace the threads back to their origins. When we see a Stetson hat, hear a country ballad, or watch a Western film, we should recognize the African and African American roots running through them. By recovering these hidden influences, we not only restore credit where it is due, we also enrich the meaning of the cowboy itself. No longer a symbol limited to white ruggedness, the cowboy becomes a reflection of America's diversity, shaped by Africans, Mexicans, Native Americans, and more. In truth, the cowboy is a global figure, born of cross-cultural exchange and survival on contested land. And at the heart of that story, standing tall in boots and hat, is the black cowboy. When people imagine cowboys, they often picture rugged men riding into the sunset, revolvers at their sides. Rarely do they picture women in this story, and even less often do they picture black women. But the truth is that black women were an integral part of the cowboy world. They worked on ranches, they rode horses, they herded cattle, and they contributed to the shaping of Western culture in ways that have been almost completely erased from history. To understand the full story of the cowboy, we must bring these women out of the shadows and into the light. On the frontier, survival was not a matter of gender. Everyone worked. Black women who had been enslaved on plantations brought with them skills in farming, animal care, and food preparation that were indispensable to ranch life. After emancipation, many of these women found employment on ranches alongside their husbands or relatives, taking on labor that was just as grueling as that of men. They tended to livestock, managed gardens, cooked for large ranch crews, and sometimes even broke horses or drove wagons. Ranching was a family operation, and women's labor was essential to its survival. But there were also women who stepped beyond the expected roles and became cowgirls in their own right. They rode, roped, and competed, often outperforming men. One of the most remarkable figures was Mary Fields, known as Stagecoach Mary. Born into slavery in Tennessee around 1832, she made her way west after emancipation. In Montana, she became a legend for her toughness, running a stagecoach route where she defended her deliveries with a rifle and revolver. Though she wasn't a ranch hand in the strict sense, her work embodied the same grit and independence associated with cowboys. Her story reminds us that black women could be just as daring and fearless as any male cowboy. On ranches, black women often became the keepers of tradition. They brought music, storytelling, and spiritual practices from African roots into cowboy culture. Around campfires, while men told tall tales, women sang songs and passed down stories that preserved both African heritage and frontier experiences. These oral traditions became part of the broader cowboy identity, though history later stripped away their African and female origins. The idea of the cowboy as a storyteller owes much to women who preserved rhythm and voice in the hardest of times. Clothing also tells part of this story. While Hollywood portrays cowgirls in glamorous costumes, sparkling shirts, fringed skirts, and wide-brimmed hats, the reality was more practical. Black women on the frontier wore durable skirts or trousers, boots, and wide hats, similar to the men's. They often crafted their own clothing, blending African-inspired patterns with frontier practicality. This not only kept them safe and functional on ranches, but also expressed individuality in environments that were often harsh and dehumanizing. Their influence on frontier fashion, though less documented, was very real. Perhaps the most overlooked contribution of black women to cowboy culture was their role in healing. On ranches, accidents were common: broken bones, animal injuries, diseases, and infections. Black women frequently served as healers, drawing on African herbal knowledge and midwifery traditions. They knew how to use plants to treat wounds, how to manage fevers, and how to care for both people and animals. This knowledge was crucial on isolated ranches far from doctors or hospitals. In many ways, they were the unrecognized doctors of the frontier, saving lives quietly and consistently. Yet despite these contributions, black women in cowboy culture have been doubly erased: erased for being black, and erased for being women. Hollywood westerns rarely show women in roles beyond love interests, damsels, or barmaids. The idea that a black woman could ride a horse, manage cattle, or even fight off bandits simply didn't fit the narrative. This erasure distorts not just women's history, but the history of the entire American West. Consider rodeos, for example. Black women were not absent from these competitions. Some competed in riding and roping events, often alongside their husbands or brothers. Others worked behind the scenes, training horses and preparing livestock. The spectacle of rodeo, now thought of as a masculine showcase, was in reality a family affair. Black women brought grace, skill, and stamina to the sport, even though they were rarely celebrated publicly. In recent years, historians and cultural revivalists have begun reclaiming this history. Organizations like the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo have highlighted the contributions of black women in modern rodeo culture, showing that the legacy continues. Women like Jonetta Starr, Speed, and others in contemporary black rodeo circuits prove that the image of the black cowgirl is not just historical, it is alive and well. By acknowledging them, we reconnect to a truth that has been buried under stereotypes and silence. The importance of recognizing black women in cowboy history goes beyond fairness. It reshapes how we think about the cowboy itself. If the cowboy is supposed to symbolize freedom, resilience, and independence, then black women embody these traits as much as any man. Their presence broadens the symbol of the cowboy, making it inclusive rather than exclusive. The cowboy is not just a solitary man on horseback. It is also the mother tending the fire, the healer applying remedies, the rider steering cattle through rivers, and the storyteller preserving culture for the next generation. By recovering these stories, we begin to see the cowboy not as a narrow myth, but as a living, breathing community. And within that community, Black women were central, equal in courage, skill, and spirit. The silence around them was not natural, it was constructed, and it is our job now to break that silence and let their voices ride again. If there's one place where cowboy skills became spectacle, it's the rodeo. Rodeo is the performance stage of ranch life, the public arena where riding, roping, and wrangling transformed into competitive sport. Today, we see rodeo as deeply American, steeped in Western identity. But what is often forgotten is that black cowboys were there from the very beginning, shaping rodeo's traditions, competing in its events, and leaving behind a legacy that endures in ways most people never realize. Rodeo grew out of real ranch work. After long cattle drives, cowboys would test one another's abilities in roping calves, breaking broncos, or wrestling steers. These friendly contests soon evolved into community gatherings and eventually professional events. Black cowboys, who made up as much as 1/4 of the workforce on ranches, naturally took part in these contests. Their skill with horses, cattle, and ropes wasn't just for show, it was their livelihood. When rodeo culture began to crystallize in the 19th century, black cowboys were central, even if history books have tried to write them out. One of the most famous figures in this story is Bill Pickett. Born in 1870 in Texas, Pickett was the son of formerly enslaved parents. From an early age, he worked as a ranch hand and developed a reputation for daring feats. But what made him legendary was his invention of bulldogging, the rodeo event, now known as steer wrestling. Inspired by the way trained bulldogs controlled cattle by biting their lips, Pickett developed a method where he would leap from his horse onto a running steer, bite the animal's lip himself, and wrestle it to the ground. Crowds were stunned by the spectacle. Pickett's innovation became a cornerstone of rodeo and is still a staple event today, though of course without the biting. Pickett's fame spread far beyond Texas. He toured with the Miller Brothers' 101 Ranch Wild West show, performing in front of audiences across the United States, Canada, Mexico, and even England. In an era when black performers faced racism and segregation, Pickett broke barriers, though promoters often billed him as Mexican or Indian to make him more palatable to white audiences. Still, his talent couldn't be denied. He starred in early silent films, making him one of the first black cowboys to be immortalized on screen. His life exemplifies both the brilliance of black rodeo pioneers and the prejudice that tried to erase their identity. But Pickett was not alone. Dozens of black cowboys competed in rodeo during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They rode broncs, roped calves, and showed off horsemanship that rivaled or surpassed that of white competitors. Their names are less remembered today because mainstream rodeo circuits, dominated by segregationist policies, often excluded them. Yet in local and regional rodeos, they were stars. Communities of African Americans gathered to watch their own heroes ride and rope with astonishing skill. As rodeo became more professionalized in the early 20th century, the barriers grew higher. White promoters controlled access to the biggest events, and Jim Crow laws reinforced segregation. Black cowboys were often banned from competing or relegated to menial roles. Yet, despite exclusion, they continued to create their own spaces. Informal rodeos on black-owned ranches and in African American towns became celebrations of skill and resilience. These events were more than entertainment. They were acts of cultural preservation, keeping alive the traditions of ranching and cowboy life that mainstream narratives tried to silence. In the modern era, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo has become a vital institution. Founded in 1984, it was designed specifically to celebrate black cowboys and cowgirls, reviving their legacy and giving them a platform to showcase their talents. Named in honor of Pickett, the rodeo travels across the United States, bringing audiences face to face with the living tradition of black cowboy culture. Spectators see everything from barrel racing to bull riding, performed by African American riders who continue to carry the torch of their ancestors. What makes the Bill Pickett Invitational so powerful is that it connects past and present. When a black cowboy ropes a steer, or a black cowgirl races around barrels, they are not only competing, they are reclaiming history. Every event challenges the myth that the West was exclusively white. Every cheer from the crowd affirms that the cowboy's story belongs to all Americans, and especially to African Americans, whose labor and genius built the culture of the frontier. Beyond rodeos, black cowboys have influenced popular culture. The swagger, the style, and the spirit of rodeo competition seeped into music, film, and fashion. From the blues songs of the Deep South to the country music of modern stars, traces of black cowboy rodeo culture can be found. Even hip-hop artists have drawn inspiration, reimagining cowboy imagery in new ways that blend past and present. Rodeo gave black cowboys a stage, and though history tried to limit it, their performance still resonates. The rodeo legacy also highlights the resilience of African Americans in the face of exclusion. Denied access to mainstream arenas, they created their own. Denied recognition in textbooks, they built living traditions. Today, when young black children attend a Bill Pickett rodeo and see riders who look like them competing with skill and courage, they see themselves reflected in a history that had been denied to them. That reflection can be life-changing. So the next time you see a rodeo, remember its roots are not just in white cowboy mythology. They are in the calloused hands of black men and women who worked the ranches, who invented the events, who dazzled the crowds, and who passed down a legacy of excellence. Rodeo at its core is a black story as much as it is an American story. And until we recognize that truth, we are only watching half the show. When most people think about cowboys, they don't think about music. They picture dust, spurs, lassos, and cattle drives. But the truth is, the cowboy's life was filled with song, and black cowboys were some of its most influential singers and storytellers. The myth of the cowboy that Hollywood sold us, the lone white rider with a guitar, crooning under the stars, was built on a foundation that African Americans helped create. If you listen closely to cowboy music and folklore, you can still hear their voices, their rhythms, and their stories echoing across the centuries. On long cattle drives, music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. The job of moving thousands of cattle across dangerous terrain was exhausting, and restless herds could stampede at the slightest noise. Cowboys sang to calm the animals. The slow, steady rhythms of their songs lulled the cattle into a sense of peace, reducing the risk of chaos. Many of these cowboy lullabies drew from African traditions of call and response, field hollers, and spirituals. Black cowboys brought these rhythms with them, blending them into the new soundscape of the frontier. One striking example is the song, "Goodbye Old Paint," one of the most famous early cowboy ballads. Scholars believe it originated with a black cowboy named Charlie Willis, a former poor black worker who became known for his singing on the trail. Willis's version carried the cadences of African American spirituals, shaping a melody that soothed both cattle and cowboys alike. When white cowboys later adopted and spread the song, they rarely credited its black origins. Yet every time it was sung around a campfire, Charlie Willis's voice lived on. Black cowboys didn't just influence songs, they influenced instruments too. The banjo, often associated today with country and folk music, has African roots. Enslaved Africans brought versions of the banjo to the Americas, where it evolved into a central instrument in frontier music. On ranches and cattle drives, banjos mixed with fiddles and guitars to create the soundtrack of cowboy life. That mixture of African and European traditions became what we now call country music, though its black origins are often ignored. Without black musicians, cowboy music would never have developed into the form that shaped America's soundscape. Folklore was another essential piece of cowboy culture, and here too, black voices left an indelible mark. Cowboys passed long nights, telling tall tales, spinning legends of bravery, trickery, and adventure. Many of these stories echoed African trickster tales, where clever underdogs outwitted stronger foes. Figures like Brer Rabbit, rooted in West African Anansi stories, slipped into cowboy lore, disguised in Western clothing, but carrying the same lessons about survival through wit and intelligence. These tales offered not just entertainment but wisdom, reminding listeners that strength wasn't everything, brains could win the day. In the 20th century, as Hollywood began to shape the cowboy myth, the influence of black cowboys was systematically erased. Singing cowboys like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers became iconic, while the African-American origins of the songs they performed were forgotten. The image of the cowboy with a guitar under a wide western sky was popularized on the big screen, but the fact that black cowboys had been there first, singing, playing, and creating the very foundations of cowboy music, was left out of the picture. Yet the story doesn't end with erasure. Across the United States, black musicians carried cowboy traditions into new genres. The blues, born from the same field, hollers and work songs that soothed cattle, became a cornerstone of American music. Later country and western artists like DeFord Bailey, the first black star of the Grand Ole Opry, continued the cowboy musical legacy, though he was often sidelined by racism. In recent years, artists like Lil Nas X have revived the black cowboy image, blending hip-hop with country in ways that expose the diversity of Western identity. Even beyond music, the myth of the cowboy itself, the image of independence, resilience and freedom, was shaped by African American experience. For black cowboys, the frontier was not just a place of opportunity, but a space to reimagine themselves outside the strict racial hierarchies of the South. Songs and stories gave voice to that reimagination, celebrating freedom while acknowledging hardship. When you hear the refrain of a cowboy ballad or the rhythm of a trail song, you're hearing coded expressions of resilience that come straight from African American survival strategies. Today, cultural projects are working to restore this forgotten history. Documentaries, books, and musical revivals are shining light on the black roots of cowboy music. Festivals sometimes feature reenactments of trail songs and storytelling sessions that highlight the voices of black cowboys. These efforts are not only about setting the record straight, they're about reclaiming pride. For young African Americans who grow up seeing only white faces in cowboy films, hearing that their ancestors were the original singers and storytellers of the frontier can be transformative. The myth of the cowboy is powerful because it represents freedom, but the irony is that this myth was built by people whose freedom was always contested. Black cowboys, through their music and folklore, transformed hardship into art. They took the pain of slavery, the grind of ranch life, the dangers of the trail, and turned it into songs that could calm 1,000 restless cattle. They turned long nights under cold skies into tales that warmed entire communities. They made culture out of struggle, and that culture still shapes America today. So the next time you hear a cowboy ballad, or see the romantic image of a lone rider under the stars, remember, that myth has black voices in it. Voices that sang to cattle, voices that strummed banjos, voices that told stories of survival and hope. Without them, the West would have been silent. Without them, the cowboy's legend would have had no song. By the late 1800s, the frontier was changing. Railroads cut across the open plains, barbed wire divided the land, and the cattle drives that had defined the cowboy era began to fade. But for black cowboys, another, more dangerous change was underway: erasure. While they had been central to ranching and cattle work since the beginning, their stories were increasingly silenced in the culture that followed. The Wild West was being mythologized. Dime novels, traveling shows, and eventually early films crafted a fantasy image of the cowboy as a rugged white hero. In reality, many of those heroes were modeled on black men who had ridden the trails, fought rustlers, or trained horses. Yet, when their stories were retold, their blackness was stripped away. Names became generic, and the cowboy of legend was transformed into a figure who looked nothing like the men who actually lived the life. Take Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick. He was a former enslaved man who became one of the most skilled and famous black cowboys of the 19th century. His autobiography brims with tales of cattle drives, rodeo victories, and daring adventures across the West. But while his book sold well, mainstream culture did not crown him a hero. White writers took the cowboy archetype and sold it back to America without crediting the people of color who had built it. Or consider Bose Icard, a trusted trail boss who worked closely with famed cattleman Charles Goodnight. Goodnight himself admitted that Icard was indispensable, strong, dependable, and wise in navigating the dangers of the trail. When Icard died, Goodnight even erected a marker in his honor, calling him a faithful cowboy. Yet Icard's name was never elevated into legend the way white counterparts were. The pattern repeated across the West. Black cowboys, who had taught roping, riding, and ranching, were written out of history. Instead, white cowboys were glorified as the quintessential American archetype. By the time Hollywood began churning out westerns, the black cowboy was nearly invisible. If he appeared at all, it was as a minor character, never the hero. This deliberate erasure was about more than entertainment. It was about power. The cowboy had become the national symbol of freedom, resilience, and rugged independence. To admit that the first cowboys were often black was to admit that African Americans were foundational to America's identity, something a segregated, Jim Crow-era nation was unwilling to do. And yet, black cowboys did not vanish. They kept riding, kept working, and kept passing down their traditions. In towns across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, black families held rodeos, trained horses, and celebrated their heritage, even when mainstream America refused to. Men like Bill Pickett, the inventor of bulldogging, a rodeo event still performed today, became legends in black communities. His name was eventually recognized by the Rodeo Hall of Fame, but only long after his death. The struggle for recognition was long and painful. Black cowboys had to fight not just for fair pay and safety on the trails, but for their place in memory. Every story told, every photo preserved, every rodeo won, was an act of defiance against a culture that wanted to erase them. By the turn of the 20th century, the cowboy era was waning. But for black cowboys, their fight had only just begun. The fight to keep their legacy alive in a world that seemed determined to forget. And that struggle leads us directly to the heart of the finale. What happens when a people reclaim their history, and how the legacy of black cowboys shapes America, even today. The story of the black cowboy is not just about the past, it is about the present and the future. For decades, their contributions were buried beneath myths designed to uphold white supremacy. But today, the truth is breaking through, and the legacy of the first cowboys is finally being restored. Look at the modern rodeo scene. Across the United States, black rodeo associations thrive, from Texas to California. Families gather to watch riders and ropers whose skills trace back directly to ancestors who worked the ranches and cattle trails of the 19th century. These events aren't just entertainment, they are acts of remembrance, living testaments to a heritage that refused to be erased. Museums and historians are also rewriting the narrative. Exhibitions dedicated to black cowboys are touring the country, highlighting the photos, tools, and oral histories that prove their central role in shaping the West. Scholars are publishing books that dismantle the myth of the all-white cowboy, showing instead a frontier alive with diversity: African, Mexican, indigenous, and white men, all working side by side. Even Hollywood is beginning to catch up. Films and television shows are slowly introducing black cowboys as central characters rather than background figures. While the progress is uneven, each portrayal chips away at the decades of invisibility, and in doing so, they remind audiences that the American story is far richer than the myths we grew up with. But perhaps the most powerful part of this legacy is symbolic. The cowboy has always stood for independence, resilience, and freedom, values America claims as its own. When we acknowledge that the first cowboys were black, those values expand. They no longer belong to a single group, they belong to all of us. The cowboy becomes not a symbol of exclusion, but of inclusion, a reminder that African Americans were never outsiders to the American story, they were central to it. Think of what this means for young people today. A black child watching a rodeo, or seeing a photo of Nat Love riding tall in the saddle, can look at that image and say, "That's me. I belong in that story." That recognition is healing. It restores pride that was stolen, and connects communities to a history of resilience, skill, and brilliance. And for the broader world, it is a lesson about truth. History is never neutral. It is shaped, edited, and often manipulated by those in power. The myth of the white cowboy was no accident. It was designed. But myths can be rewritten. Truth, once uncovered, has a way of changing everything. So here is the truth. The first cowboys were black.
Oh,
They were men of African descent, who brought their knowledge of cattle herding, horsemanship, and resilience to the American frontier. They carved out lives of skill and dignity in the harshest of conditions. And though their names were buried, their legacy never died. Today we honor them not just as footnotes, but as pioneers, innovators, and cultural icons. Without them, the story of the American West is incomplete. With them, it becomes whole. The cowboy, America's great symbol, was born black. And as long as their story is told, America itself becomes more honest, more inclusive, and more just. This is the truth. This is the finale.